Hello everyone, today we read and comment the third chapter of the first book of von Clausewitz, Vom Kriege. The text follows. If we now turn to strength of mind or soul, then the first question is, what are we to understand thereby? Plainly, it is not vehement expression of feeling, nor easily excited passions, for that would be contrary to all the usage of language, but the power of listening to reason in the midst of the most intense excitement, in the storm of the most violent passions. Should this power depend on strength of understanding alone? We doubt it. The fact that there are men of the greatest intellect who cannot command themselves certainly proves nothing to the contrary, for we might say that it perhaps requires an understanding of a powerful rather than a comprehensive nature. But we believe we shall be nearer the truth if we assume that the power of submitting oneself to the control of the understanding, even in moments of the most violent excitement of the feelings, that power which we call self-command has its root in the heart itself. It is, in point of fact, another feeling which in strong minds balances the excited passions without destroying them. And it is only through this equilibrium that the mastery of the understanding is secured. This counterpoise is nothing but a sense of the dignity of man, that noblest pride, that deeply seated desire of the soul always to act as a being endued with understanding and reason. We may therefore say that a strong mind is one which does not lose its balance even under the most violent excitement. So, relatively short passage compared to the ones we usually read now, and next one I'm seeing here is going to be pretty hefty next time. Nevertheless, as always, very important and very meaningful here beyond actually war, because as you understand it here, I think there is not even a single reference to warfare proper, right? But so and that's why von Clausewitz Vom Kriege is so such an important book. I would say, even just philosophically speaking, it really makes you understand a lot about yourself. But it does it without flattering you, right? And it can be harsh even, but it's nevertheless particularly important because nobody really wants to get lied to. Does this concept is central in many ways, many people's lives, I believe, and we tend to fail to recognize it. I believe we're talking about the strength of mind or soul, as von Clausewitz defines it, and he says, what is this about? So he gives a fairly simple explanation of this, as the whole matter is, in terms of, it's not a very complex conception. Basically, the strength of mind or soul is not a vehement expression of feeling, nor easily excite passions, for that would be contrary to all the usage of language, right? Because here it says, basically, if you are a strong person, normally, this is a term that is used as to define a person who is pretty steady, is pretty firm, and usually cold-blooded, right? And this is what it's really about. And in fact, he defines it as the power of listening to reason in the midst of the most intense excitement, in the storm of the most violent passions, right? And this is something we all struggle through, right? It's not simple. It's not simple to express oneself, because we're in many ways dominated by passions. I like personally to, and because also it's a Clausewitzian concept. Remember when von Clausewitz basically says, we have to give up the concept. We can't approach war scientifically, right? Because there is nothing like science of war by definition. Why? Simply because we are not pure rational beings. And it turns out we're not even overwhelmingly rational. We are quite minoritarily rational. We're mostly led by passions, right? And this is really pretty realistic assessment, of course. But if you reflect about it, it's really the root of many people's problems, because essentially we live in a world in which we we praise reason. I mean, I'm a rationalist, for example. I believe that of all the various isms that you can get married with, definitely rationalism is, as long as in fact you reason proper, because rationalism it's ideological extremization, right? You say rationalist positions often fail to acknowledge that we are largely dominated by passions, but fundamentally you can't say you're a rationalist, or maybe because it doesn't suffice to say that you're reasonable. Also, because probably you tend to be not. But say you're a rationalist because you believe, you hope, you can test, even empirically or even scientifically, that reason does bring to good results, right? You know, if you're able to calculate literally everything into an equation, you're able to solve it perfectly, ideally. Well, it turns out we live in a world where everything is so complex, it's so damn complex, that even making a very simple statement is a tremendous problem. You know, it poses some of the most, not just, you know, scientific problems, but really ethical ones, because at the end of the day, what matters for us is not properly, you know, being satisfied with that 2 + 2 makes 4, but what you can practically do with that and how that can make you feel better, right? Can make you feel more satisfied. And it's not a nihilistic or just sensualistic approach to reality. I mean, feeling well is something that goes beyond that. It goes at a much deeper level. And in many ways, probably the feeling, not even happiness, is what truly matters. I mean, happiness is probably, you know, not only the unnecessary in some measure, but, you know, the moment in which we feel more satisfied in many ways, it's while we are struggling towards what we think it is happiness. And when we get to the point that is obviously still a limited point where we're kind of satisfied, but we want to take the next step, and this means growing, right? And acknowledging actually that having made this probably was a terrible effort that maybe was worth the pain, but that showed you essentially a more rational line, right? You know, the reason this is something you can measure even in your own life, depending on how old you are. I mean, you realize that reason tends to grow, right? At least some form of the very interesting difference is actually between intelligence and wisdom. For example, there are very intelligent people who are not wise at all, or, you know, very wise people who are not particularly intelligent at all. But so I will not indulge into this, but it's obvious that reason is basically the mathematical tool that you wish you could use perfectly with the same, you know, level of perfection of maths that in this sense expresses the most rational language that humanity has ever created to solve problems. And we have seen that in von Clausewitz theoretical construction, it would be pretty much all about that, right? You know, it is what, and it's not just because of von Clausewitz, it is really what the majority of thinkers would like it to be. Fundamentally, von Clausewitz is writing, as we know, in order to, in a polemical relation, fundamentally, towards those who think that there can be a science of war, that you can extrapolate the theory by essentially denying the average, the reality, right? Von Clausewitz is telling you that you don't have to abandon rationality, not at all. You should always struggle into this. But the reason why you have to do it is exactly because your rational approach is limited by nature, by physics, by reality in the way we know it. And therefore, you should struggle towards that direction. We've also observed, he actually told us that intellect is, in war, is definitely more important than let's say strength, for example, or courage, actually. But it tends to be, actually, or at least courage is more easily, it's more readily available most of the times, so that it has a lower price, where intelligence is definitely way more prized, and it is most of the times you assess a military engagement, etc. What in there really lacked in order to explain approximately why one side lost, and tracing the causes into that specific from that specific defeated perspective. So von Clausewitz is telling you, okay, you should keep on this track, keep as much as you can, but you should also be aware that no matter how you make an effort, you're still limited, right? And it happens all the time that reason is overwhelmed sometimes by passions and emotions. I mean, obviously reason kind of guides always human mind in some way, but there are certain situations when things get complex, and especially during a combat, in a fight, broadly meant, not just the individual one versus one. Never think that here we're combat or fight from Clausewitz is one versus one. It's by definition war is this duel on a large scale, so it's something, it's scale that can vary all the time, but the concept is the same. But let's say that it's very easy because there is an evolutionary base. Of course, von Clausewitz didn't reason still in these terms, but we know it, that for which we are programmed, we are based, we are set onto a certain level, average level of rationality, and in order to cope with a certain specific range or level of conflictuality and of complexity at the end of the day, we have to aggressiveness in this sense is the measure it's the instrument, that you have to use in order to emerge from in order to solve the equation, right? Because you don't just have to be intelligent, but also you have to be resourceful. We have seen how resolution is important in the process. That is a form of courage. And it's also a more prized one than the average courage that everybody can have under particular circumstances in order to make something, in fact, courageous, but not particularly intelligent. I think it's totally dramatic how many people believe that really what you take first of all into a fight in order to win a battle is courage. Courage is literally the cheapest resource you can find literally everywhere among all peoples in all history, and that's something you never lack. Individual courage is boundless, as much also as cowardice, but let's say and that's something fluctuating, but you can't find a standard if you keep to the naturally certain standards also of military training and that are shared by all civilizations throughout our multi-millenary history. But it's obvious that aside, we are prepared. We are, evolutionaristically speaking, set on levels that do not contemplate this greater form of military organization, right? I mean, civilization is something that started together, with this form of more sophisticated military organization relatively few millennia ago. War is much older, right? So it's not really, probably we are enough smart to take some decisions that are evidently more than just a single fight. But let's say it happens in many situations, especially when a certain level of force is involved that is also not usually the natural one, etc., in which we lose it. We freak out, and we lose reason at that point, and that is a problem, right? Because war, as we've seen in von Clausewitz, is the realm of danger, right? Uncertainty. Well, the worst fears that can materialize in reality are there, right? At the moment, at the single moment. So that's why the strength of mind or soul, as von Clausewitz calls it, is so important, because it's what at least the military leader should always have in order to withstand the problems. Naturally, this strength is also always relative. There is not a it depends on the level of threat that you're meeting, the challenge you're facing, the complication of it. I mean, so that von Clausewitz is not talking about the degrees in which this strength is measured, but rather of the character in itself, of the feature in itself, of this capability, the way it is. And here, it's not surprising, in fact, that he defines this strength as the power of listening to reason. Listen carefully the use of words. Words are extremely important. This is not a chit chat. This is just, you should be able to understand every single word that we're saying. The power of listening to reason. Now, this is a dramatically important expression, in my opinion, because this is not the ability of being reasonable, right? Because you can't be even, here eventually von Clausewitz makes the differentiation between let's say the intelligent person, but also the reasonable person. There are kind of two different things, right? But here it's not even about being reasonable or rational. Here it means to be able to have the power, actually, the power proper of listening to reason. The power, not the ability, not the subtlety, not the the tiny little character of it. This is talking about power. That is force in a given amount of time, right? So it's something it's something in fact powerful. It's overwhelming. It's something that really makes an impact, and that should, for what ultimately? To punch harder? No, to draw you away from this storm of emotions. To listen to your reason. That is to say, wake up, don't lose it, stay focused, maintain concentration, don't lose awareness of what is going on, right? Where into this, and this is also very powerful language here, lexicon used, in the midst of the most intense excitement, in the storm of the most violent passions. Now, we all will live into these things. I mean, we all have for sure our breaking point. We definitely all have our strengths and weaknesses and excitements and passions, and we get carried away by them, right? And it's dramatic because that is we all know that these feelings are not there because we're good or bad people, but that's simply because how we work, mechanically speaking. Emotions are as soon as there are certain pathological limits, of course, but normally certain reactions are perfectly natural. It's normal to be to fear. It's normal to be angry. It's normal to be anxious. But these feelings still tend at the moment, in absolute terms, doesn't matter how important for coping with the situation, in fact, for maintaining the same emotional balance at the end of the day, because they are like outbursts in the way they work. They're kind of shocks that our organism self-inflicts on itself in order to keep us awake or reactive or able to cope with the problem. But as we often said, civilization has developed now at a level in which things are way more complicated than what our evolutionary base is able to cope with, and most of this problem can be solved only through reason. So since we can't cope with these things, not just because they're a different level, but because also they imply much stronger responsibilities and outcomes, etc., and larger outcomes, more influent outcomes, then we are naturally programmed to bear on average that the best way to solve it is actually reason. I mean, reason is theoretically boundless, even if naturally we all have our limits, but this is not the point. The point is that you can be way smarter than you are. You can definitely stimulate your intelligence. You can grow wiser, and And von Clausewitz is a great advocate of this perspective. He believes that there is no easy way to become, for example, a great commander, a great military talent, right? Even these characters that he gives to you, this, say, mental capabilities that seem to be more or less grounded in individuals, actually they can be cultivated by, in a certain measure, and some of them are, at least in some cases, are impossible fundamentally to be earned by certain types of people. I mean, there are certain types of people that simply can't, right? That simply don't have this in the way they are, characterally speaking, and we know it. Psychologically speaking, there are plenty of tests can predict fundamentally what your attitude is, what your behavior is, even partly predict what your success in society will be, and stuff like this. So it's von Clausewitz, as I was saying before, doesn't flatter you. He really tells you the thing as it is, but at the same time, it tells you also you can't just be hope to be a child prodigy. You have to work terribly hard in order to develop disabilities, because you can't even be born with some kind of advantages written into your genome. But if you don't get educated, if you don't make your mind work, well, those are gonna remain there. They're not gonna make any difference. Excuse me, I drink a little bit. So you understand how things are not easy and they are not simple. And I was, by the way, some weeks ago, I was looking at certain von Clausewitz videos on YouTube, because I'm planning to make a video in which I will look at random YouTube videos that are out there about von Clausewitz, and then looking at kind of the comments you can find on those. I won't signal anyone, hopefully, but you can arrive there to get the completing comprehension of Clausewitzian theory, right? People pretending to read, I don't know, to listen. It's full of these audiobooks about the Vom Kriege that people like listen for the first time, like for 2 hours, and then they comment by saying, "Oh, this von Clausewitz is nothing special," and starting to list things from which you understand that they completely don't know anything about, and like pretending they know. That this is the level of of the average intellectual preparation or honesty that you can find around. Von Clausewitz here shows you something like a huge, bold, as a world that is terribly difficult to work within, to work in, but that you can sort of decipher in part for your needs, right, for your existence. And this is a great metaphor of existence. People presume that it takes, I don't know, just to read one thing to say, I understand this, right? Just because, of the act in itself. If you don't make an effort, where do you think you want to go? There are people who read books for all their lives, and they're not particularly intelligent because they don't make an effort, right? And it takes a lot of effort. You have to get an A, in order to you have to strive, you have to come to aid certain things. It's terrible sometimes, but it must be your duty. In many ways it is, because life forces you to be put in front of these choices, and it's not that you have much of an option at that point. So either you get, and believe me, difficult things are scary, because when people get to know things, they get scared. It's natural. When people get burned, they try to hide away, but at the same time they're gonna remember that burn, and that is a pretty very profitable way to learn, because we're also programmed in order to that. What shakes us more violently is at the end of the day what also makes us reflect, and etc. So it's interesting to read this passage, because here you really can relate um, about this intense excitements, this the storm of the most violent passions. We all get overwhelmed many times. It happens dramatically frequently, every day. It's like we would like to cope with a situation with intelligence or understanding, but it turns out it's pretty tiring. It takes a freaking lot of effort. All right, and instead you can just play on it a little bit with your character, your ego, your stuff, and it turns out when you meet a tougher challenge, that doesn't work. So, and it's already good at the beginning to be aware that there is this other option, but tendentially we're lazy, and until we're not cornered, we tend to simply delay this confrontation with ourselves, right? So this is powerful, in my opinion, from a psychological point of view, and it's a constant ethical challenge. Also, because most of the times you don't even know what you have to do. That's the real problem. I mean, it's not just a matter of being, woken up from the storm of passions into, being brought back into reason, as if that was a place you can sit comfortably in. Reason is something that it's like suspended in the air. You have to make the effort to remain chained to it, and it tends to slip away if you lower the guard, and also it's something artificial in many ways, and it's dramatically difficult. But it turned to accomplish this. But it turns out our mind, I mean, the more is acquainted with this challenges, and the more it's able to cope with them automatically, like shaping itself in a way that is at least more capable to contain this challenge, and to expand your boundaries and your abilities, right? And so that's what growing really is, right? So the strength of mind or soul in this sense is augmentable, right? Von Clausewitz gets more specific, says, should this power depend, so this power of listening to reason in the midst of passions, depend on strength of understanding alone? We doubt it, he says. So no, because he makes this example we're alluding at before, the fact that there are men of the greatest intellect who cannot command themselves certainly proves nothing to the contrary, right? For we might say that it perhaps requires an understanding of a powerful rather than a comprehensive nature. Now this is also very, very meaningful. You have, he says basically that there are very intelligent people with a great mind that is capable of really going very far. But it turns out that some of them cannot command themselves, right? So this proves that objectively it doesn't depend on intelligence alone, on understanding alone. And what he defines this power as, he says that it perhaps requires an understanding of a powerful rather than a comprehensive nature, right? So it's still about intelligence, but it's not really all from it. It's not even based on it, and we'll see here later where it comes from. But here the distinction is quite important. You can have a comprehensive nature. That is a person who looks at things and kind of broadly understands them, because you know a lot about them. You have read, you have experience about them, etc. But this ability of staying focused when things are gonna get pretty messed up, and maintaining that intelligence and making it not drawn into the storm of passions, it requires power. Requires a character that is not purely intellectual. It's something that has to do with other strengths, right? And so, and always remember this. Like, there are people who are very intelligent, but they kind of are, they can't be even passive. Maybe they know something, but they can't. Maybe when they're triggered, when they're attacked, when they they're confronted with, they put aside what they know and they stop fighting for what is right, that they knew what it was, just because, at the moment it seems more convenient for other reasons. That's a comprehensive nature, but not a powerful one. And the reason why that person should instead fight for a reason is that it is reason, right? And also in here, the thing gets a bit more complicated because, as we have said before, we don't have ever a purely rational character. So actually, very intelligent people are also, I think, very thoughtful and very careful about what they say and how they say it, the words they choose, etc., because they want to be understood, because they pose themselves problems that, intellectually speaking, are important, right? At the same time, you could say that some of them do this because they're kind of in love with their intellectualism, right? They indulge into this, like saying, I can't reach far complexes, and let's simply toy with them. Doesn't matter if they're really true, but at that point, it's not a consequence of reason, is it? I mean, if you don't even try to test it in its effectiveness, in its efficacy, like under a scientific proof, you can't fundamentally you can't figure things out. They remain hypotheses and so on. So some intellectual people are also like that. I can also relate in part. I mean, there are lots of things I believe, but that I still should verify. But in general, it takes an intelligence that not only is more developed, because even if you are able to travel very far with intelligence, you usually get pretty you know how to speed ahead, right? I mean, the more it's a progress that goes by levels. So it's interesting because it's if you completed the other levels before you get to the other ones, and I'm not talking this on the base of actual knowledge proper, but in kind of the range of possibilities that you can expect from those same levels of understanding. But the problem is that when you break the mold, when you pass to the next level, let's say, you comprehend that all in one. So you broaden this picture, and that's when it gets also more difficult to dominate, because then through this mental structure, you're able to reframe your knowledge, to tear down your hierarchy of values and rebuilding it on that base, right? So it's something very challenging. It's partly also the reason why there can be some legitimate doubts and worries. But here, von Clausewitz is not talking about that, because the power of withstanding against uncertainties is something more. It doesn't even pertain to intelligence proper alone. And in fact, here he says, going on, but we believe we shall be nearer the truth if we assume that the power of submitting oneself to the control of the understanding, even in moments of the most violent excitement of the feelings, that power which we call self-command, or self-control if you want, has its root in the heart itself. This is a very, very deep feeling. A very, very deep idea. And we'll see now what by heart von Clausewitz means in the most romantic way as possible, actually, because this heart here means really something noble, right? It's not just your guts, your purely sentimental side. This is really about what your consistency is about as a human being. It's what you're probably really grounded in, because always remember, even reason is just a tool at the end of the day. So this self-command, self-control, how many times in your life you wished you had more self-control. It's a lot, probably, right? And controlling yourself is pretty damn hard, right? Especially when, here we're talking about just feelings and reason, but there is more than that. I mean, there is also pain, sufferance for other reasons, and being self-controlled in these occasions, it's something that burns energies, that makes you feel weaker. It's something that has cost. It's very demanding, right? But it turns out this is the price of civilization. This is what you have to face necessarily if you want to improve. Otherwise, you will remain always the place you are, and there is no way out of it. Believe me. Or there is a life of fundamentally restricted possibilities, what you can be, right? So there is a spectrum of the best you can be, and trying to work for it. This is also a Jungian concept, for example, that also was yet to come. But that's really how powerful and deep von Clausewitz is getting at this point. So self-command, self-control. It's something that has its roots in the heart itself. It's an ethical matter. It's an ethical challenge, right? Because we all know how our intellect works. We all know how faulty it is. We all know that there is no certainty out here. That it appears that, especially the more you progress, that there is something that doesn't work. People generally content themselves, as we were saying before, with limited explanations, with the idea that somehow, things are a bit too difficult for me to bother themselves with them, so let's just remain at this level and see what happens. And what they don't know, and this is really the problem with ignorance at the end of the day, not really... I actually don't criticize ignorance most of the time, because I believe we are all ignorant. But let's say that it's a very negative side, but for the person, is that the person doesn't know how far he or she can go until, let's say, it, for the sake of grammar, until it doesn't reach that level, right? I mean, that's the real problem with intelligence, is that, and why it's hard to make people reason, and to go further, and to make them improve themselves, because until you know how much there is there, you don't really know how it is. You can't know it, and therefore you can't pose yourself the problems for things that you even ignore in your existence. And it turns out, and I believe that this is a dramatically overlooked problem in our society, is that it turns out we have the answer for these things. I mean, you could definitely tell young people what they're gonna expect, that they have to expect when they're gonna grow, right? For what they're going to grow. I mean, what are challenges, how things works. So, and I don't know why it doesn't happen. I don't know whether it's because these fields are maybe not particularly, known. I mean, these are mostly psychological observations, I believe. I've never studied psychology, but I got interested in it, in some way, in some consistent way, and I wonder, in fact, how you can go past that kind of scientifical detached scientific observation of an individual, is starting building an ethics on the base of this scientific knowledge that we have, that can educate people to expect certain things, right? I mean, in the world I was raised, at least, these are still things partly that people like your relatives, your parents, your grandparents tell you about, because they have seen it all before. They're older than you and they know what it is. But there is still a great superficiality in the self-awareness of people relative to these topics. And if for example, I'm fairly young. I mean, I'm not extremely young anymore, but still pretty young by several standards. And I believe that already what I've learned in part of my life at this point, it's something I wish I had known. I was told about because knowing it, it's impossible, but I was told about before, right? It's like even for certain paths, I mean, they can even very trivial things like, what it's like to go to school or to go to university or to go beyond that. Those are things we could make a terrific job at by telling our people, and we generally don't. And this teaches you self-command. And just reading this passage, you understand how many ideas and intuitions it can spark, right? And it's embarrassing that we have these works, we don't read them, that we somehow think it's just empty words or something that overly pompous, etc. I don't know how it's ever been your first approach with von Clausewitz, but at the beginning, he's kind of scary. Like, especially if you try to read him like at little chunks, but scattered, like for finding out certain concepts. You can't understand him like that, and therefore reading the Vom Kriege is already something that self-disciplines you, right? Our people read this stuff without stopping to understand what they're reading. And everybody can do that, like skimming the lines and saying, okay, well, it talks about this and that, yeah, but this is not something you can read like that. It's something you have to study proper, right? And self-control and self-command is so important because other people do not expect it in many ways. And that's why, for example, in war, just to make an analogy about this, think about training and discipline. Soldiers get fundamentally possibly the worst training of all. I mean, of course, yeah, I don't know, I think certain astronauts maybe have, I don't know, but there are certain levels of pressure that definitely military training involves. It's also pretty tough. It's not just it's primarily psychological, as it should always be. But it's also tough physically speaking, and it often comes in both forms at once. And that's what you need, though, because what you're gonna meet on the ground is something that, I mean, not even training can properly reach. I mean, there are a few examples in history of a training that's so tough that it kind of looks like real fight. I mean, it's as if you had already been into. It happens. It can arrive at those levels of brutality. But in general, and everything of it is aimed at self-command. Let's be honest, right? And that's tough. That's tough because your brain, when you're under terrible pressure, starts saying, "What the hell is going on here?" Like it starts going in 1,000 directions at once, trying to figure out a solution, because it turns out that we make a much more intense use of our brain when in fact we are under very heavy pressure, unless we don't break down. In that case, we can even damage our organism, etc. But it's this is inescapable if you want to know how it is without never having done it. So that's why training and this self-control of self-command has to be so intense, because otherwise it doesn't quite work, does it? Right? And also in there, it's a bit like the levels. Even in military training, especially from a physical point of view, it doesn't really take to do something over and over and over again. I mean, there is quantity is not quality, and there are certain things you have to do just in a certain amount of time to basically understand what it is and know how to do it, but then passing beyond, because otherwise it gets too repetitive and you also kind of lose it. The same goes for the military employment proper. I think the average day of combat that a person, that an adult, a healthy individual can sustain is like 40 days in an entire lifetime. Yes, it's right. I mean, and these are things that the modern military perfectly knows, but up to 70 years ago, they were practically unknown. Even 80 years ago, the concept is that we can take just a certain limited amount of stress especially in all one shot. So we also have to be very careful, because it turns out we can do great things, but we're also extremely delicate. And you can't afford make a terrible effort yourself. And this is what young people believe, right? Because that's also how, biologically speaking, we are structured. I mean, young people are less self-controlled. They're also stronger, and they have this greater capabilities. And then they can, they kind of slow down in terms of physical prowess, etc. But they get smart, right? At least this is the theory, and this is brutally also how for animals it is in general. I'm not saying that our society produces terrifically smart people. I believe that most people remain with the mind of a 20 years old, for all their lives at the end of the day. But this is an approximation, but let's say at levels, for example, of intellectual development, that also here is important, right? And I would like to go on with this to look a little bit more of what this heart we spoke about is, right? So it's still part of the understanding. Remember, this self-command still stems partly from the heart, because the heart participates, let's say that the intelligence participates to that too. But it's not exclusively that. For Clausewitz says, it is in point of fact another feeling which in strong minds balances the excited passions without destroying them. This is also particularly important. You don't actually need to repress yourself when in the strength of mind. As we were saying before, certain emotions are natural. They're kind of obvious. You can't stop having fear, right? But one thing is being scared. One thing is acting upon. Upon this. I mean, like giving way for no rational reason, right? That's why there is a kind of an ethical challenge in the concept of training itself. It's not just pure brutality. It requires a sort of self-esteem, of control of yourself, or even from a ethical point of view. Here it says, and it is only through this equilibrium that the mastery of the understanding is secure, right? So it's important that this is an equilibrium. Von Clausewitz doesn't say, of course, that reason should simply, dismiss the other, the like feelings and passions. You can't eliminate that. It's silly. The same von Clausewitz said, you can't. You simply can't. That's the reason why you can't have a science of war, but just an art of war, because we work in a way where we're not machines, right? And fortunately, we're not machines, because machines are not able to solve certain problems. The real ones, at the end of the day, that we need in a dynamic environment, especially like in such a fast-evolving one like war, right? So this equilibrium should be sufficient just for mastering your understanding. For having the understanding, mastering the situation, right? So that's all it takes. Basically, it only takes that your understanding still works effectively. Because at the end, there is also an economical logic behind this. I mean, it's what we were saying before in terms of the degrees, right? Clausewitz doesn't tell you this should work at this level of understanding. It should be IQ of 120. It doesn't say that. He's basically telling you you're gonna meet with certain challenges that you have to cope with in an effective way by mastering this. So your passions with understanding in a way that is enough for reaching your goal. So this power of understanding it's something we all have, but in different measures it varies. Also in the measure in which we apply it, there's definitely an intellectual component to this process, to this work, but it also stems from other things, and the important is that, however, it gets the thing done, right? It gets you where you want it to. Clausewitz goes on and says, this counterpoise is nothing but a sense of the dignity of man, that noblest pride, that deeply seated desire of the soul always to act as a being endued with understanding and reason. Here there is probably one of the most beautiful descriptions of human nature in the Vom Kriege. This counterpart, it says, is nothing, or let's read it, but the sense of the dignity of man. You know, the idea of dignity, and it's something we are starting to forget about, I believe, a lot, unfortunately. We get devastated sometimes by this lack of self-respect at the end of the day. This idea that we can have a noble pride about ourselves, right? We often get stemmed into this. We're told, our society doesn't tell us to be to have dignity, right? It doesn't it doesn't tell us anymore to be proud. They want to bring us down. They want to make us believe that we are somehow inadequate, unsuitable, inappropriate, that we're always doing a mistake. We need instead to feed these feelings to the idea that there is at least a virtuous model, an upright model, a trustworthy model, a respectable way of living. And dignity is exactly this one. And this is also part of the Jungian concept. I mean, there is a good you can achieve. There's a lot of good we can all achieve. We all need to be reminded that this is there, because some of us has really forgotten what this really is about. And there is no self-control anymore. That's the real point. I mean, when we lose control, we do feel ashamed. I don't know if you ever noticed this, but it's sort of like this. I mean, you can't even be fighting for the right way, but the way you do things does make a difference. It does make a difference to beat someone with intelligence compared to passions, right? That with passions, it's particularly important today, because everybody can shout as loud as they can in silencing people, but that's not a virtuous way to live, to behave. And it turns out that most of the time this happens because not only there is no dignity, but also there is no intelligence at the end of the day. But once again, intelligence alone is not enough. You have to believe into this. You also you need to believe that you have to be self-controlled. You have to be responsible for yourself. And what we're constantly told is that we are defined by something else's standard, right? You know, what kind of what's your background, what you can, and then you being defined by that. No, you get defined by yourself, by your choices. That's what really matters. That's why you can't have single thought, for example. That's why you have to keep on struggling, because it turns out that our civilization has been built upon this struggling. Because if there was no aggressiveness, if it was no but in a healthy way, I mean, even aggressiveness, of course, is a pretty serious thing when it gets, out of control. But this idea of pride, of nobility, is definitely fueled partly by the idea that there is a tough world out there, that things are not always cool and nice, because otherwise we wouldn't need reason, right? If everything was like perfect already, if we lived in the golden age, nobody would need reason. That's fundamentally what the Bible says, with Adam and Eve, and they got aware by sinning, and that's probably one of the deepest, most universally understand. Once you get this ability of reasoning, of understanding, of being aware, you automatically become challenged from an ethical point of view, right? It's unescapable, and that's a heavy burden. That's an heavy burden, and it was definitely understood in that this was at the base of civilization. The civilization carries within itself bears with itself the fruits of evil in many ways, but it's not all about evil. What we're being told now is that it's all evil. Like that our whole society is evil, that there is no, there's just black and white, right? And there is no middle ground. And that's what we strive to tell in Schwerpunkt, to tell things in a way that tries to go through at the core of things. Not because there is a batch of guys sitting there just evaluating what other people say, but because they're challenged themselves and they want to know and they strive to understanding. We live in a world that is going down. There are too easy times, and we lose the challenge. And it's not necessarily bad, but we are in front of another challenge now. And this still derives from ourselves. It doesn't derive from some guy out there in the street that has done something against us. I mean, it's partly like that because social problems happen all the time, but it's still, it's still from the individual things are gonna change. You can't expect, things to change just by delegating someone for doing what at the end of the day. If you're the one who's in charge, you're the one who's in control of this. And for Von Clausewitz, this is terribly evident. You can't lose control, and that's the real point, is that we are rarely faced in situations that put us under test. That's why tough times are so necessary, because they straighten you up. They make you understand what really matters, and it's dramatically difficult to understand it without these difficulties at the same time. So, at the end of the day, life is not easy. This is the point. But Von Clausewitz says, right, here, that is also, perhaps also the most important thing of the phrase, that there is this deeply seated desire of the soul always to act as a being and endued with understanding and reason. In other words, our soul always wishes for us to be intelligent and reasonable, and it has a delight, a great satisfaction. It's where this noble pride stems from. It's that, yeah, I've controlled myself. I managed to do this. It worked because I worked hard as well, and I made it possible. And this thing worked for me, right? It's very difficult. It's very difficult. There is no easy solution to this. You have to struggle through it. And it doesn't happen. And I'm deeply convinced that such events happen because we have lost this. We tend to lose so easily this sense of responsibility, especially when there is someone who pushes into that direction by saying it's always someone else's fault. What are you doing personally to change this? And von Clausewitz concludes this passage by saying, "We may therefore say that a strong mind is one which does not lose its balance even under the most violent excitement." Right, very simply. So, let's say a strong mind or soul is the one which does not lose its balance even under the most violent excitement. Try to do it. It's difficult, but it's worth the pain. It will make you feel better about yourself. That's really what defines it. And you understand where there is a struggle in here. I mean, it's not a matter of simply, saying this, okay, let's try it, let's switch on this mode and we'll work. You have to work actively in order to make it happen. It's no joke, it's difficult, it's dreadful, it's terribly challenging, and it will become worse. This is also what it's evident, is that we're not just making it difficult in the sense that it's difficult before, but the more that it goes on, it really it becomes ever difficult to bear, but at the same time you're doing something good about it. Now, this is a great intuition, in my opinion, because if you think that the objective of your life is just to be happy, you fundamentally lose great parts of it. Like it's you probably just are obsessed about this, and you see it doesn't work because you're not trying hard where you really need it. And be aware that this is a great this is backed by psychological evidence, by all kind of social studies and all evidence that we have in relatively to our world and how in our human nature. This is no some 19th century author finding this out and then someone buried it. Many people, of course, maybe do not know it. It would be very important to look at this, not just into the background, let's say, of the philosophical background of the end of 18th and the beginning of 19th century Europe from Clausewitz times, but also to all what science basically revealed to us. Right, and it perfectly matches. That's the thing. That's what really brings you the greatest intuition at the end of the day. And it's so great to see that these great minds had already figured out before. So that you can't laugh at them. You can't, like in those YouTube videos that I was mentioning to you before. You can read this audiobook you find somewhere on YouTube and pretend you have understood von Clausewitz and commenting it weirdly. But that's how low we have gone, I suspect. I mean, I don't think that before it was that better. I mean, but society was radically different. Now we arrived to a point where in the development of our own civilization, we still haven't invested in this intellectual development that seems to be now necessary for every kind of activity. I believe that, especially there are certain currents of libertarian thoughts that I personally deeply appreciate as a philosophy, and mostly kind of libertarian oriented, but that tend to say complete freedom, like to do literally everything you want, like sitting on your couch eating chips all day and just wasting your life on Facebook. That's you're free to do it, but it turns out that it's not a pretty healthy way to live, and still we are tendentially brought to that. So it turns out that the society we live in, as we said before, it's artificial. So if you want to cope with that, you also have to to adapt to it, artificially speaking, because at the end of the day, that life is gonna crush you. It's gonna make you lack purpose. So we're look at the world. We're literally the wealthiest moment in history that I've ever seen. I mean, the way we're rich is disgusting. You do not tell us, but between I think 2007, I remember like the first 10 years of up to 2012, basically we have like made half of the people who lived before in their conditions of levels of ultra poverty halved. I don't know how to say it. Wait a second. Disappear at least, not in a bad way. We had halved, right? Numerically speaking, statistically speaking, and that's like one of the biggest things ever happened in the world, in human history. It's like the most massive improvement of life quality of human civilization, and all we do is bitching about ourselves. And there must be a reason that it is also that wealth, materially speaking, is not really what makes you happy. And even though you need it to help you, but it's not the ultimate. It's not the ultimate thing. That's why our depression. Why is depression augmenting? Why are people, suicides, for example, increasing? Why is that? Well, there is a lack of commitment, and I believe that the great challenge of our world, of the next centuries that we're starting to figure out now, is that we have come from from a world that up to 100 years ago was all about fundamentally practical activity, material activity. The people who were required to have, for example, to know how to apply theoretical thinking, that is to abstract things from material problems, etc., were like 1/10. Now we can't be like that. We're mostly about theoretical thinking, and our society has not adapted to support this, and we need this to go beyond, right? And there are so many implications from this point of view that this point I think they're really an emergency. I mean, we will pay the costs of this pretty soon, in my opinion, if we don't move. And this is probably, one of the most serious and critical problems we have to face, together with others, of course. But it seems that everything really revolves at the end of the day around this stuff. I will not venture into finding solutions at this point, but it's obvious that if you really want to do something, it starts from you. So I suppose that reading for real and studying hopefully is a good moment to start. Traveling, looking around the world, learning new languages, knowing history, study a freaking lot of history. People do not know history. Let's be honest about it. We are disgustingly wealthy and disgustingly uneducated. That's a big problem. That's a massive problem. Our historical awareness it's completely insufficient. Even in the most developed countries in the world, you think the most developed countries in the world kind of have a satisfactory historical awareness? They do not have, by definition. Like, we just look around. We're screwing everything up because we're too ignorant for what we need at this point of our development, and it's bad because nobody cares. And the wrong thing about this is that there is a regressive thought kicking in, and that's even worse because you think that more or less this stuff is this is a challenge that we haven't never met actually as a civilization before. We don't really know how it works. I personally believe we will kind of adapt as we've always done, so we will find solutions, but at the same time there are certain signals that tell you that things are not going so well as before. The radicalization of political thought is something incredible. But in terms of derationalization at the same time, it's just about emotions and feelings. The worst reason, right? Whatever. Otherwise I start rambling too much. But these are important things. Wherever you want to frame them, like, you have to take them into account. You have to realize that they do exist, and whichever things they are important. And you have to tell other people. You can't sit there and just pretending, okay, well, I heard this thing on YouTube. Well, you should start having a talk about this with your relatives, with your friends. I mean, someone who can we can't lend an ear to say, okay, let's see this, and you will find that there's much of reason around this, and many people just don't care. I mean, I believe that the majority, however, in fact, of people just say, well, okay, but it could even be worse, let's not complain. This is kind of the worst attitude you can have. If you don't constantly need to improve yourself, it means you're dead inside. You have lost your purpose. That's why people get so more depressed, and because they don't see the point, they don't see the purpose anymore. And okay, so for this time, I think I stop here. Next time, wow, we have a pretty long and hefty passage. And it's cool, it deals with obstinacy, intelligence, and resolution, and strength of character in general, sensitivity, energy, etc. But yeah, and even with idlers, interestingly enough. So, so for next time. And for now, I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it, otherwise leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming contents. And for now, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.